Who doesn't have moments from your past that make you cringe? Who hasn't said, I can't believe I said that? I can't believe I wore that. I can't believe I thought that. I can't believe I did that. You ate dirt. You wanted to be a Ghostbuster. You shoplifted gum. You tried to be a white breakdancer. Plenty of liberals also want to abuse history to control the present. And last month, a scholar named James Sweet caught hell for calling them out for doing just that. He criticized the phenomenon known as presentism, which means judging everyone in the past by the standards of the present. It's the belief that people who lived 100 or 500 or 1,000 years ago really should have known better.
All right, buckle up, because what we're about to talk about isn't just a hot take, it's a flamethrower aimed straight at the heart of the woke movement. Bill Maher, the guy who spent decades waving the progressive flag, has basically looked around at his old political allies and said, yeah, you've lost your minds, and he's not whispering it, he's blasting it through a megaphone. If you've been paying attention, you've probably noticed that Maher's tone has been shifting over the last few years. This is a man who used to cheer on every progressive cause, celebrate every liberal win, and happily join the cultural pylons against the so-called bad guys. But lately, it's like he's turned around, realized the mob is starting to look a little too much like the thing it claims to hate, and decided it's time to hit the brakes before we drive off a cliff. Honestly, who among us hasn't had a cringeworthy moment in the past? You know the ones: fashion choices that should have been criminal, weird childhood ambitions like insisting you were definitely going to become a Ghostbuster, or maybe even shoplifting a pack of gum because you thought it made you rebellious. We've all done dumb stuff, that's just part of being human. So when Maher points out the absurdity of judging people from hundreds of years ago by today's moral standards, a concept scholars call presentism, he's not defending bad behavior, he's defending perspective. The idea that someone living in 1525 should have the same worldview as someone armed with an iPhone, Wikipedia, and TikTok-fueled moral certainty is ridiculous. But here's the problem. The so-called woke mob often doesn't deal in perspective, it deals in moral absolutism, applying 2025 standards to people who lived in an era when even soap was considered a luxury. And they're not just doing this to historical figures, they're doing it to everyone right now.
And the problem is that nobody ever gets canceled for being too woke. So you can say the craziest thing, like men can have babies, and then nobody will, even though people are thinking, well, that's kind of nuts, nobody will say it. They'll just fall in line. Oh, yeah, exactly. That's what I've always thought. Men can have babies, sure. I saw a dude who was glowing. I mean, and that's the problem.
And it's totally insane.
Cowardice.
Yes, it is. It's moral cowardice, isn't it? But
it's intellectual.
I think, and it also comes from a place of reality, that fear, because they see people around them literally getting cancelled, getting shamed and abused and hounded out of jobs. And they think, I don't want it to happen.
Bill Maher has been hammering this point. Nobody ever gets cancelled for being too woke. People can say things so absurd they sound like rejected Monty Python's flying circus sketches, and instead of pushing back, many just nod along because they're terrified. They've seen what happens when someone even mildly challenges the prevailing orthodoxy. Online mobs swarm, media smear campaigns begin, and people can lose careers overnight. That's not free speech, it's moral cowardice, and worse, intellectual cowardice, the refusal to even ask questions because of fear over what the answer might reveal. Maher sees it everywhere. Professors facing backlash for quoting offensive language in lectures about offensive language, comedians censoring their own material, and entire TV shows being rewritten to satisfy the most hypersensitive corners of social media platforms like X, formerly Twitter, https://x.com, utm_source=chat.com. We're talking about a cultural climate where nuance isn't merely ignored, it's hunted down and eliminated on sight.
I can't count the number of stories I've either covered on the show or just read about of professors, of colleges, which are supposed to be the bastions of free speech, who said something that was just an opinion.
One
different.
professor in America, who gave a lecture for 25 years about the use of offensive language.
Mm-hmm.
And then some students complained about his use of offensive language in the lecture about offensive language.
Right.
And he had to lose his job. And at that point, I just felt that was peak woke insanity. He literally was lecturing about offensive language and using offensive language to illustrate it.
They have no sense of nuance. They have no sense of context. They just know certain buzzwords or certain concepts are out of limits, off limits, and since social media is just a bunch of mean girls.
And then there's social media, oh boy. If the founding fathers had platforms like X, formerly Twitter, half of them probably would have been cancelled before the ink on the United States Constitution had even dried. What was once imagined as a digital public square has, for many, turned into a gladiator arena where people are less interested in debating ideas and more focused on humiliating their opponents. The toxicity has become so pervasive that it's spilling into real life. You've got people refusing to date someone solely because of political affiliation. Imagine it, the date is going great, you're laughing, connecting, and then comes the question, so, did you vote Republican? And suddenly it's check, please. At that point, it's no longer politics, it's tribalism. Bill Maher calls this out because he remembers when liberalism was more closely associated with lifting people up, tolerating different viewpoints, and fighting for equality without tearing everything else down in the process. In his view, the woke movement has twisted those ideals into something almost unrecognizable. It's no longer about making the country better, it's about catching people in mistakes, publicly shaming them, and projecting moral superiority while often contributing little toward actually solving real-world problems.
This is what's so obnoxious about that side of things, that just idea of, we're not really lifting people up. Liberalism is about lifting people up, not catching people.
And tolerating people.
It's not about white self-loathing.
Yeah.
It's about, yes, we have a horrible history in this country. Let's make it right in the ways that make sense. It's not just about catching people.
And the hypocrisy is staggering. We live in a country that has made massive progress over the last 70 years. Women can vote, own property, and lead major corporations like those in the Fortune 500. Civil rights have expanded dramatically, and barriers have been broken across business, politics, sports, and countless other fields. Yet some critics argue as if the country is living in a dystopian nightmare worse than places like Russia or North Korea. Realistically, there's a major difference between a society where people can openly criticize the president on live television without being imprisoned and authoritarian regimes where dissent can carry severe consequences. Still, these comparisons are often made because acknowledging genuine progress would also mean acknowledging that significant battles have already been won. And if those victories are recognized, it raises an uncomfortable question: what remains to rally against?
So I think that really is kind of the center of the country. Old school liberalism, take a victory lap. You kind of won on a lot of things, but it's another funny pathology of liberals. They don't want to acknowledge progress because they somehow feel like if I acknowledge progress, well, then I'm not as authentic a progressive. It's right in your name. And that's what you're selling, progress.
And then there's the Trump factor. Oh, this is where Bill Maher really breaks ranks with the left. The endless attempts to take Donald Trump down through legal cases, Maher has straight up said this was going to backfire. Dragging him into court over something like the Stormy Daniels case might have felt satisfying for MSNBC viewers, but to the rest of the country it ended up making him look like a political martyr.
On Donald Trump, all this legal mayhem that's flying out, does it actually empower him? Does it have the opposite effect, perhaps, to what the Democrats were hoping?
Yeah, well, that was the end of the show tonight. I was talking about the Stormy Daniels issue. I mean, it's always going to strike people as sex. When it's about getting a guy for sex, I don't think they should have discouraged. I guess Alvin Bragg can do what he wants. But if I was the president or somebody, I would have discouraged them quietly. Let's not do this. Because we're gonna see Trump hauled into court, as we did. And that's going to be the big story. And it's going to be just high fives on MSNBC. And look, I was thrilled.
And he was right. The wall-to-wall coverage turned Trump into the most talked-about man in America. Instead of damaging his career, it supercharged it. It was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline, only resulting in a bigger blaze. Maher also often points out what he sees as the absurdity in Hollywood. He talks about how movies from just 15 years ago, made by some of the most liberal, woke-approved directors and actors, would now be torn apart for not having enough diversity, not because the story required it, but because a checklist demands it. In his view, this isn't about authentic representation anymore, it's about box-ticking and virtue signaling, and in the process, creativity is being stifled. Characters can feel like they are inserted into films to make a political point rather than to serve the story. Entire scenes sometimes exist just to announce, "Look how progressive we are," rather than to entertain. And to critics like him, that's not art, it's propaganda in a polished package.
I'm constantly amazed when I rewatch movies from only a decade or so ago, and they were made in a way that today would get you burned at the Twitter stake. It's complicated. From 2009, to name just one of many I could choose, was made by a who's who of the most blue-ribbon certified Hollywood liberals, woke-approved and Democratic Party contributing, from the stars to the producers to the director, but it apparently occurred to none of them to have any kind of minority in the cast. You would need a divining rod to find a person of color within 500 feet of this movie set. But if they made it today, they'd do better.
And it doesn't stop at pop culture. The so-called woke movement has even gone after some of America's most celebrated historical figures, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Theodore Roosevelt. Statues have been toppled, names removed, and legacies reduced to a single flaw. Critics argue that this approach can turn a person's entire life into a verdict based on their worst actions, even if those same individuals helped shape the very freedoms people enjoy today. To them, it represents a kind of historical arrogance, judging people from 1776 as if they were tweeting from an iPhone in 2025.